Hello, everyone. Welcome again to the Harvest Community Church podcast. This is Chris Quinn, one of the associate pastors at Harvest. I'm joined by Pastor Matt and also a special guest this morning. What did you tell us about our special guest, Matt?
Yeah, so I'm excited to have our longest distance ever special guest. Travis is with us from 12 time zones away, which is definitely the record for the longest distance Harvest Community Church podcast ever. So Travis, welcome. Kind of tell us, for those that don't know, just a quick overview of kind of who you are and what you're doing.
Yeah, we are 12 time zones away. We have a Christian bookstore here that in a predominantly Muslim country. We've been in this part of the world in one way or another since 2002. So in addition to helping people get Christian books and Bibles, we build relationships with people around us, and who we are as followers of Jesus is a natural part of that.
Awesome. I love the fact that technology allows us to do this real time. This will be fun.
Mm-hmm. So, Travis, why don't you tell us a little bit about some cultural differences between your context and the context of the Pacific Northwest, where we are?
This is a good question. There are fewer differences than you might think. Probably the most obvious is that the dominant religion here is Islam. But like the Northwest, day-to-day life it's not very religious for most people. In the Northwest, many might say I'm a Christian, but not many of those practice following Jesus. In the same way, here, many might say I'm a Muslim, but not necessarily practice Islam. So the way a Westerner sees time is pretty linear, but that isn't the case for people in this context. If I set up a meeting with someone, for example, and then I show up an hour late because my aunt came to town unannounced, that's perceived very differently in the West than it would be here. In our Western culture, we think in terms of transactions. The transaction serves the schedule. This is why we have a coffee date with a friend, but then there's this mutual agreement that in about an hour, we're going to go somewhere else and do something different. But as you go further east, including here, time is meant to serve the relationship. And so that 1 hour coffee date might start an hour late, but it might also go 3 hours too.
And so the reason we brought Travis on to the podcast this episode is we want to talk about evangelism. And so, Matt, why don't you give us just a working definition of evangelism?
Yeah, a more difficult to define, not difficult, a more challenging to define question than it should be. So I think it's important to start with the definition. At one level, the word evangelism is very straightforward, but in recent history, particularly here in the U.S., there's been lots of different understandings of it. So to be just really clear, at the simplest terms, evangelism is sharing the gospel verbally with another person. It's not to be confused with other things that may happen to support evangelism, such as initially building a relationship with the person or caring for people and doing good works in our community in order to show, the love of Christ and all that kind of thing. Those are all things that can be connected to evangelism because they're ways to build relationships with people and make an impact, and they're all very good things. But they're not evangelism. Evangelism is actually sharing the gospel of Jesus with somebody. So one of the things I've said in the past is that helps me think about it is this. If you cannot move from spiritual death to spiritual life based on what I've told you, then I have not yet evangelized you. So there's a lot of things that we may do to support evangelism, and we should do, building relationships and so forth. But when we're talking about evangelism, we're talking about helping people know how to be saved, how to move from being dead in sin to being alive with God forever because of the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's a great definition, Matt. So Travis, why don't you, because of your context where you're at, describe your understanding and experience of the gift of evangelism?
I think for me, it's most easy to describe in terms of what I experience. When I talk with someone about God, my heart comes alive. Listening to someone's story and trying to help them see a right relationship with God that He made them for. In that context, is a little bit like, for me, like a chess nerd, how they might feel describing the latest defense that they just mastered. evangelism, like any other spiritual gift, it's not given to us already mature. If I don't spend time honing that gift, I shouldn't expect to develop it. Evangelism has been kind of a funny thing for me because I took the gifting and out of a desire to obey, I set out to do it. But the lenses that I have had on were shaped by my culture. And so developing the spiritual gift of evangelism has meant a lot of learning how to take those lenses off and replace them with lenses representing the way that God's family works.
So you've mentioned, let's stay on the spiritual gift track for a second, Travis. You've mentioned a spiritual gift of evangelism. We actually just recently did a podcast on spiritual gifts in general, and now we're talking about one particular spiritual gift. And obviously, that's a gift you would say you believe you have. When did you realize you had a gifting toward evangelism?
I didn't become a follower of Jesus until I was in college. I got involved with the student Christian group as well as Harvest Community Church and began learning how God's household operates. Now, as it relates to this question, I saw scripture teaching us to go and make disciples of all nations in Matthew 28. And then I saw scripture also teaching that each follower of Jesus is given a spiritual gift in First Peter. And no matter how uncomfortable I was, I sought to just be obedient. Now, never being one that ever half-heartedly does anything, I'd go out to like the park blocks down at Portland State University, where as a student, and talk with people there and talk about scary. I was filled with angst about what I would say, that I wasn't naturally aware of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. But I came alive when I talked with people about God. So the thing that's kind of funny about me with this, and was somewhat confirming for me that I have this as a spiritual gift, is that I'm also an introvert. So in most circumstances, I get worn out by being around people. I get worn out by sharing the gospel too, but it's still invigorating to me. A lot the same way that like when you get into a car accident, you have an adrenaline rush. So you're really alert, but then you crash later on. So I'm still an introvert in that context. It doesn't mean that they don't go together. But yeah, so I think that's kind of how I kind of became a little bit more apparent to me that I have that gift. Not because I was particularly proficient at it.
That's good. I love the fact that you're somebody who loves evangelism, and I think, and you just likened evangelism to being in a car wreck. I'm not sure I've ever heard anybody do that before. That I'm glad we got that one recorded. That is awesome.
It's on record.
So one more follow-up to that, because I also do love the fact, in all seriousness, that you distinguish between your spiritual gift and what you would identify as your personality, because that was something we talked about previously on that previous episode. So those are two different things. But as somebody who has a spiritual gift of evangelism, how have you seen and encouraged people who may not have this spiritual gift to go ahead and get involved in sharing the gospel?
That's a great question. You know, God sometimes asks us to operate outside of our spiritual gifting. That's just the reality. I'm still responsible to serve others, even though I don't have the spiritual gift of serving. Evangelism is not any different, really. You know, we need to set our minds on obeying God and trusting Him in the areas where we feel especially weak. But I'll tell you that those are the times where I pray a lot more in those areas. Now, I'm not saying there's never times where you or I won't chicken out or feel like we blow it. Even with that spiritual gifting, both of those apply to me. You know, we certainly need to remember that God's pleasure on us has nothing to do with our performance here. But okay, so that's the cold hard truth. But you know, for someone without a spiritual gift of evangelism who doesn't feel particularly good about it or good at it, here's where I encourage people. One is start with the core of what's driving how motivated you feel about talking with people about God. And there's a lot there to unpack. You read a whole book or two about it, but you know, ask God to show you how He sees people and give you a compassion for people. Also, we need to ask God to give us a desire for others to know God that actually moves you to want to talk with people about God, if that's what's hard for you. And then study what the Bible has to say about how important this is, how important this Great Commission is, and ask God to help you apply it to the here and now. So then, you know, work on things that are the obstacles for you talking with others about God. You know, the broad categories might include things like what I believe about God and evangelism. You know, if you see evangelists as someone selling ketchup popsicles to old ladies in white gloves, then that's going to get in the way, right? It also includes dealing with, what I believe about me. So if you, like me, struggle with codependency, you might see someone saying, I don't want to talk about God as a rejection of you personally.
Mm.
And so the anxiety that goes with that, or the potential for that, is going to get in the way of you talking with people about God.
Mhm.
So, Travis, do you ever feel anxiety or fearfulness or any sort of uncomfortability when it comes to evangelizing when you think about doing it?
Recognizing that God's given me a spiritual gift for evangelism had little to do with my anxiety, since my
Hmm.
fears going into the given conversation, whether with a classmate that I knew or someone I'd met sitting at a bench, they were super real.
Hmm.
And they are even now, after spending more than 20 years talking with people about God from time to time. It also didn't have much to do with the success as we think of it in the West, um,
Hmm.
because very rarely was I praying with someone at the end of the conversation. Um, so the short answer to the question is, oh yeah, all the time I feel anxiety, especially leading up to a conversation. It usually tapers off after the conversation gets started and gets rolling, but that's very normal. I wish I could say otherwise. People shouldn't be surprised by that.
Do you feel any discouragement afterwards you share the gospel? And then how do you process those feelings and stay at it, even when you feel those kind of things?
Yeah, I definitely have felt discouragement at times, and part of this is, like our culture is a fast food culture.
Hmm.
We want results and we want them now.
Mhm.
And I remember getting my first care package in the mail from friends in the U.S. It was great. I ate enough Reese's peanut butter cups to kill a small horse. But the package took 2 months to get there.
Mm.
Hmm.
The next time I was in the U.S. after that, I ordered something online and it was at my doorstep in 2 days.
Mm.
Hmm.
And we get used to that as a culture, and so we apply it
Hmm.
to everything in life holistically, and so we apply it to the gospel too. I want to share the gospel with this guy and have them pray to receive Jesus. But the thing is that uh, we have to resist the urge to demand the instant results, because often God knows that it would be more violent to bring a person instantly to a place where they're willing to follow him than it is if he takes the time cultivating the soil in their life.
Hmm.
Anyone that's gardened before knows that if a gnarly weed grows up next to a vegetable, you have to take extra time and care in pulling that weed so that you don't damage the good plant.
Mhm.
So uh, we will want to be the one praying with that person, but the reality is that we might be just pulling a little bit of dirt away from the weed, uh, enough for the next conversation to pick up where we left off,
Hmm.
so that that person is eventually ready for it. And so if I don't do that, of course, I'm going to be super discouraged that it didn't go quite to the finish line like I wanted it to.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I love that that analogy that you just shared of the garden. I mean, understanding that people are in process, and God occasionally makes radical changes in a person's life, but the norm is that change happens slowly over time.
Yeah.
Is helpful. I find when my own emotions are getting anxious or tense or impatient. Um, if I can shift my mindset to not thinking about the snapshot, but thinking about the movie, the video, and realizing this is just one scene in a person's life, and who
Hmm.
knows how God may use it, but it's not just about this moment, it's about what God is doing in their life overall. Sometimes that can help kind of calm my sense of immediacy.
Hmm.
Which actually leads me maybe to another question, Travis. You referred to prayer earlier. Talk a little bit more about the role prayer plays in, so much of what you do is trying to build relationships with people around you to lead to gospel conversation. So what role does prayer play in that? Like, how do you pray? Are you just praying generally for people? Do you pray for people by name? Do you pray before? Do you pray after? All of the above? Like, give us just a snapshot into what prayer looks like, evangelistic prayer looks like for Travis.
Yeah. The short answer to that is before, during, and after.
Hmm.
We like to think of our schedule as ours, and so we don't always anticipate when we're going to have interactions with people where they move toward God. It's super helpful to have a reminder, for example, near your door front, or before you go out in the world, to remind you to pray as you go. Hey, God, I don't know what you have for me today, but please prepare my heart to speak and act as your ambassador when I interact with people today. And then during interactions or in the immediate ramp up to a conversation, whether you anticipate it or not, you might only have a breath to spare
Mhm.
in between thoughts and trying to listen well. But there's nothing wrong with a God help me or
Mhm.
God help me love them like you
Mhm.
type of a prayer. And then after interactions is also super important. Take the time to thank God for letting you have a place in this person's process
Mhm.
and ask God to use your words in their heart long after the conversation's finished to help them come toward Him.
Mhm.
That's great. I love that. So, what would be your typical strategy, Travis? Kind of piggybacking off of, okay, you're praying, you're feeling anxiety, but then, thinking about how you could be building relationships. Like, what's your typical strategy for how you build a relationship with a non-believer? And what has worked well and what has not really worked all that well?
Yeah, yeah. Also a good question. Be genuine. Listen well.
Mm,
I've had a number of conversations with those who weren't Jesus followers, simply because I allowed them to see that my life was just as complicated and a hot mess as theirs at times. But their expectation of what a Christian was very very different, and so it just caused them to do that sort of mental double take of to say, "Wow, this is a little different from what I expected." And so
mm,
even just being genuine around people can sometimes even lead to those conversations.
that's
Paul
great.
tells us in the Bible that he becomes all things to all people that he might win some for Christ. This doesn't mean that he did everything that those around him did, but he certainly rubbed shoulders with them.
Mm,
So let's press into that just a little bit more because, like, I started this podcast distinguishing, evangelism, sharing the gospel with people, from all of the other things that we may do, to support evangelism. And while on the one hand, I think that's an important distinction so that we are really clear on what we mean by evangelism, on the other hand, I don't want to separate those things too much to where it's
mhm.
like, evangelism is only about information transfer, just blast people with information and walk away. So could you talk about the relational side of that a bit? I mean, like, from your experience, why is it important to cultivate that kind of relationship you just talked about, to listen well? How does that relate to the actual act of sharing the gospel with somebody?
Yeah, and you put it well that like building relationship and the deeds of the gospel, those provide avenues for the gospel itself. Without relationship in some form or another, talking with people about anything of consequence is difficult.
Hmm.
Think about it. If
Yeah,
you're
that's good.
riding Max into Portland, you see someone with an Oregon Duck shirt and hat on, you might approach them and say, hey, it looks like you really like the Ducks. And in doing so, you're building relationship. So asking him or her next, what do you think about the recruiting class for next season? That doesn't seem like such a strange question to them because you built a little bit of relationship.
Hmm.
The real question is, how much relationship do you need? The short answer is not much.
Hmm.
Mm,
But it definitely helps, over time, especially when you're genuine and you listen well. Now, I've shared the gospel with people completely cold turkey, and the conversation went really well. In the short 30 to 60 seconds between walking up to them and asking them about spiritual things, I was building enough relationship to
Hmm.
broach the subject.
Hmm.
This doesn't guarantee that someone's going to be responsive to conversations, regardless of how much relationship you have, because there may be other things preventing them from being open to talking about God.
mm.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really crucial. So, trying to think like the average listener for us at Harvest who are thinking about all this and they're saying, yeah, that all makes sense, but I need some like practical tools. So, what are some practical ways for a person to get better at sharing the gospel and then also building relationships with non believers?
Whether we are a seasoned veteran or just telling someone about a relationship with God for the first time, we all have things that get in the way that make it difficult. It's super important to interview your thoughts, to note what is making it difficult for you to listen to God and do what He says here.
Hmm.
And here's a few things that I've struggled with, for example.
Hmm.
Our culture teaches us from a young age that you're the hero. It's your story and you can do anything you want to.
Yeah.
When I became a Christian, I then applied that here. I wanted to share the gospel with 20 people a day and have 25 people dedicate their lives to serving God right there.
Yeah.
The problem with this is that none of our stories works like that. Sure, I had a single catastrophic event in my life that I responded to by running to God. But if you look at my life and everything that happened leading up to that, there were years of God using people to prepare soil until I began to deal with not being the central character in the storyline of someone becoming a Jesus follower. I was nearly constantly anxious with X or Y. The X or Y person didn't pray right there after I talked with them. When I was 12 years old, I went to a Billy Graham crusade, and a man followed up with me several times afterwards because I had gone forward and prayed the prayer at that time. But it wasn't for another almost 8 years that I became a follower of Jesus. It needs to be enough for us to say, God, I don't know what your story looks like with this person, but I'm happy to follow you in being a part of this chapter. When I was a new Jesus follower, I would go into a conversation asking God to make me supernaturally aware of what was preventing that person from following him. I was usually disappointed when God chose not to do this. And I'm sure I had motives that I was not aware of. But I also saw how defensive to religious things people could be and intuitively understood that this wasn't for no good reason. We have to learn to listen well and ask good questions. If God had granted my request to just somehow osmose what this person's hangups were, I would have never learned that I need to stop thinking about what I'm going to say next and start listening to what they are saying. And when people feel heard, they trust you more. This is part of the relationship building to tell you what they think. This brings me to good questions, actually. A good question is one that is open-ended. It's not a yes or no question. And this doesn't mean that there's no space for yes or no questions, but you want to focus on asking open-ended questions. And the other part of a good question is they're the expert. The answerer is the expert in the answer. So if you're having lunch with a coworker who tells you about the Christian that came knocking at their door and how they were just glad when they finally left, you might say something like, wow, that sounds like it touched a nerve when they came to the door. Did you have a negative experience with Christians when you were younger? Or have you had negative experience with Christians? In our culture, many people are happy to give you some kind of an answer to this question because they're the expert and it's open-ended.
Okay. So when I was in seminary, I read this evangelism book. And one of the things they talked about in this book is that the hardest part for a lot of people in evangelism is just the transition from having a normal conversation about, say, like the Oregon Ducks. I'm going to bring it up unashamedly. But how do you transition from just a normal conversation to a gospel conversation where you are sharing the gospel with a person?
Yeah, and this is another thing that, there's whole books written about. One of the things that we have to do is we have to learn a new language and we have to learn a new culture. Most of us think that learning a new language and culture is something that cross-cultural context requires, but the reality is that's not true. Like, you and your coworker might be both native speakers of English, but that doesn't mean that you speak the same English. Depending on how long it's been since you first started following Jesus, you might have forgotten how to speak non-Christian English. I'm not even talking about swearing. I'm talking mainly about not speaking Christianese. With people, but using words that they will understand. Suburban Christian culture is also is different enough from secular culture that if we always insist on playing the home game and are never willing to play the away game, it becomes an obstacle. There's certainly a place for bringing someone to church with you and a time for that. And we should definitely aim toward that. But think also about about the way that Jesus did things. He rubbed shoulders with the people that need him the most in their context. This doesn't mean that he participated in every activity they did, and nor should we. But it does mean that we need to have these conversations on their turf, speaking their language. For example, if you started cycling, or even if you've been cycling for a long time, You might go to the restaurant after the ride with the others in the cycling club that you started riding with and get to know them there. You'd be surprised on their turf how much more comfortable people are and how frequently opportunities come up that, in conversation that lead toward talking about spiritual things. The practical elements of how you transition a conversation from secular to sacred, someone could probably write 5 books on, but it's important that we listen to God's spirit, and transition depends heavily on the nuance of your relationship with people. So, for example, in an interaction where I'm talking with a coworker at lunch about how hard raising kids is, it wouldn't be too strange in many cases to ask them what growing up was like for them, as a kid. After they give you an overview, you might say something like, "Hey, I've been trying to sort out what and how to talk with my kids about God. I didn't grow up in a Christian church, or I didn't grow up going to church. Was your family religious growing up?" And then perhaps follow up their response by asking, "What was the experience like for you? Or do you wish your parents had approached that differently?" Sometimes people aren't just going to want to engage for any number of reasons. We need to learn to set our own codependencies aside and acknowledge that this is okay if they don't want to engage. We don't need to force the conversation to take place, but sometimes what feels on the surface like I don't want to talk about this isn't that at all. I'll give you an example of what I mean. In a conversation with someone, they responded to my question, "Hey, what do you believe about God?" by politely saying, "Well, I think religion should be a private thing." And so I responded in that moment, by saying, "Forgive me, but maybe you can help me with that, because I've heard that a few of my friends have said the same thing. But I really want to understand why it is that you believe that it shouldn't be discussed." Now, this person then opened up to me about how they had a few really heated conversations with people about religion, some of their friends, and it resulted in a lot of hurt. By my responding to this revelation with some compassion, even just to say, "Man, that stinks. I'm really sorry that happened." It built enough relationship for me to then say, we don't have to talk about it, but right now I'm just really interested in hearing what you believe about God. And I'm more interested in that than forcing you to believe anything that I believe. What do you think? And in this case, the person was willing to continue as long as I kept my word to that. One of my favorite questions to ask people is, "What do you believe about God?" And I think it is not so much a transitionary question, because it is a straightforward question. But the answer to that is so broad and vast. And if you want if you want a question that, if the person is willing to answer, will open up a very large question and conversation, that is a great one for that. And along those lines, questions that would be in the same boat is, some people say that when you die, we either go to heaven or hell. What do you think? And especially, like, I'd say in the context of, someone talking about, their mom that passed away 5 years ago, and or talking about a friend that got into a car accident and fortunately didn't die, but is pulled through and everything. You might say, "Man, that's a big deal to become that close to death. What do you think happens when you die?" Because I've been wrestling with that question a lot over the years, and searching for answers on that. But I'm curious what you think. So there are questions that are very much related to what you're talking about and what your relationship looks like. But then there's questions that maybe have little to do with how much of a relationship you have with them. It's on multiple occasions, especially whenever I'm going through some sort of a transitionary period in my life, I've talked to a friend that wasn't a follower of Jesus, and just said, "Hey, I've really been struggling with this aspect of my relationship with God, seeing God as kind toward me and wanting good for me. I think He wants good for me. That's what the Bible says. What do you think? Do you think God is kind?" And people are often, when you ask good questions, they're glad to tell you what they think. I don't know if this is just an American thing or if this is just people in general, but we love talking about what we think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
I love, the way you're applying your initial comment, getting on their turf, playing the away game, as you mentioned it
Yeah.
earlier. Everything you just said are, I think, examples of that is encouraging and kind of convicting all at the same time, because
Yeah.
we all are more comfortable on our own turf, right? But, the gospel itself is God leaving his turf and coming into our messed up world that we messed up in order to rescue us from it, and then sending us out into this world on his behalf. And so, yeah, if we get on quote unquote their turf, they're being more potentially willing to be, because they're more comfortable, talk there. That's, yeah, I think that's golden. That's a good encouragement and challenge for me.
Mm-hmm.
So, Travis, as we kind of turn the corner and kind of wrap this up, could you give us just a little bit of a sense? You've been helping us as a church just think through evangelism, which I appreciate. I also want to just spend the last couple minutes we have thinking about your activity and ministry, where you're at. Do you have an encouragement and maybe a particular challenge that you guys are facing right now that we can know about and be in prayer for on your guys' behalf?
Thanks for asking. I have to be a little bit vague for security, but
Sure.
I will say, the work here is hard, and we're pressed from every side. There's obstacles all over the place that are threatening to either reduce or eliminate our ability to continue in the way that we would like. Um, but the encouraging thing with that is that it's also served to be a real kick in the pants that we sometimes need to run to Jesus with it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's crazy because the peace that God's been giving us when we run to Him it's nice. It feels good.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. Well, if people want to stay updated more on what's going on with you guys and kind of pray in more real time, how could they do that if members of our church want to be more dialed into specifically what's going on?
So we have a WhatsApp group as well as an update letter list that we send out regularly via email and snail mail if it's needed. You can reach out to the church in any fashion that's most comfortable for you, and they can get you contact information for how to best do that.
Awesome. Well, Travis, thank you so much for taking out your time to do this. Know it's late where you're at, probably getting close to bedtime for you. Your kids are in bed, all that. So
Yes, you're
appreciate
talking
it.
to us from the future. I can't resist the lame joke of asking, tell us what today is going to happen. Like we're just starting this day that you're ending. How did it go? No, seriously, thank you for
It
taking the
didn't
time.
end.
Awesome. Yeah, good to see you, man. Good to hear from you.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us for this episode. We really appreciate Travis joining us from all the way where he is. So thank you for doing that and taking the time to be with us today, Travis. So we will all see you all later.